The Alien series now has 6 films to its name, with its first entry into the series in 1979 and its most recent in 2017. Here I'll be looking at how the series has evolved over time, and I'll also briefly be discussing the Alien vs Predator films. Alien Covenant has only recently been released, so if you haven't seen it already, I won't be talking about it and spoiling it until the end of this video. But obviously I will be talking about the stories of all the Alien films, so avast ye mateys, spoilers aplenty. R. The series follows various xenomorphs as they rip apart unsuspecting crews, marines and prisoners, all deemed expendable by a corporation with a very robust life insurance program. The first 4 films follow the misadventures of Ripley, or I suppose her clone in Alien Resurrection, played by Sigourney Weaver in her most iconic role. But arguably the star of the series is of course the alien itself, the xenomorph created by H.R. Giger. I made a video just about the xenomorph and how it was made and designed, which you can see by clicking the button on the top of this video. I'm not going to go too much over the same ground here. But the important points are that Dan O'Bannon, the film's writer, showed the director of Alien, Ridley Scott, Giger's incredible art book, the Necronomicon, named of course by Giger as a little tribute to one of his influences, H.P. Lovecraft. I have a video about him as well. It was the Necronomicon that convinced Scott that Giger's designs were just what the film needed.
I've never been so certain about anything in my life.
And Giger worked with Carlo Rambaldi on creating a xenomorph in real life. The film is famous not only for its atmosphere, body horror and rising tension, but for its effects and ideas, much originating with Giger's work. It's about an alien that uses life forms as a host for its next generation by essentially violating them. Alien is about a crew of miners who investigate a signal which turns out to be a downed alien spaceship. The spaceship is full of eggs, and on investigating the eggs, one of them essentially becomes impregnated, and they bring back an unborn xenomorph onto their own ship. O'Bannon initially thought he would direct Alien, but he'd only directed a short before then. Brandywine Productions, who produced the film and got it distributed through Fox, sought Ridley Scott after being impressed with his debut feature, The Duelists. Despite Fox's initial reluctance about using Giger's designs, after all his art book does contain monsters with penises coming out of their mouths and condoms that are also dead babies, it was Scott's detailed storyboarding that convinced them to double the budget. It went from $4.2 million to $8.4 million. The film, as well as having the prevalent theme of an invading species that essentially doesn't just eat its prey, it rapes them and forces a sort of parentage on them, and hey, it's no accident that the ship's computer is referred to as Mother, also asks questions, as all of the films in the series do, about androids. In fact, I think maybe the creepiest moment in Alien might be nothing to do with the alien itself, but with Ash. He was embedded with the crew by Wayland, the company they worked for. His real mission was to get a specimen for the company, no matter what the human cost. Ian Holm does a great job in portraying Ash. He never gives away that he's an android, but if you go back and watch it, there are various glances and things that he does, which kind of suggest that he has ulterior motives. There are questions raised by Ash. No one else knew he was an android, so he was obviously able to mimic human beings more than just functionally. Did he know he would likely die on the ship, the Nostromo? Did he care? In fact, I think one of the strengths of the first film is that it raises questions it doesn't even attempt to answer, but that it makes feel unanswerable or irrelevant. Who was flying the ship that they found? Were the eggs on the ship on board when it crashed, or are they part of the planet? How did the company know that there was something there that it wanted investigating by accident? All of these questions are interesting to think about, and what they really do are create the idea that there's a universe outside of the spaceship, and we don't have time to learn everything about it. Because Alien was so successful and has been released and re-released over the years, it's very difficult to say how much it made. The range is huge, with estimates of between $100 and $200 million. It seems as though at the US it's grossed about $80 million at the box office, but one thing is sure, it was both financially and critically very successful. Aliens is a very different film to its predecessor. It's an action-horror hybrid, where Ripley, the sole survivor from the Nostromo incident, is picked up 57 years later, and warns some corporate types about the wreckage her crew had found, only to be rebuffed and told people live on that planet now. Oh dear. She's later convinced to travel to that colony with a group of Marines, after it emerges they've stopped communicating with the outside world. The Marines get there, find that it's a broken antenna, fix it, have a chat with the colonists and a cup of coffee, go home. It's a 30-minute movie. Just joking, it is of course a bloodbath.
There they go over there! Get them! Come on! Get them! Do something good!
Brandywine naturally wanted a sequel to Alien as soon as possible, but it took 7 years, the reason being management changes in the upper echelons of Fox. Fox was bought by Mark Rich and Marvin Davis in 1981. Not long after, Rich went on the run, fearing indictment for massive tax evasion. I guess it was a hard time to get a movie made there. The production wasn't just troubled in getting off the ground. It seems the director chosen, James Cameron, clashed with the British crew of Aliens.
The British crew, who were excellent, but they were big Ridley fans, and I think it was very tough for Jim, because I don't think they'd seen Terminator, and he kept trying to have showings, and none of them would go.
I think Sigourney Weaver is probably being a bit diplomatic there. The crew sound positively hostile. They didn't like Cameron because they thought he was too inexperienced, and they didn't like the producer, Gail Ann Hurd, because they thought she'd only gotten the job because she was Cameron's then wife. By almost all accounts, the shoot was hard. The Stan Winston-created puppets were demanding, especially the alien Queen. John Richardson, the SFX supervisor, had a limited time to make the power loader Ripley uses to fight the Queen at the end. He ended up winning an Oscar for his work on Aliens. Aliens is one of the few sequels that has a legitimate debate surrounding whether or not it's better than the original. Of course, it all comes down to taste. Alien is an atmospheric horror that layers on the tension and has these weird sexual themes. Aliens carries on those themes, but is much more kick-ass and much more about spectacle. That's not to say Aliens dispenses with horror, not at all. It begins with horror beats, but it's certainly different in its handling. Maybe you could argue that it undermines the strength of the first Xenomorph. Marines kill aliens left and right, but they're still getting outmaneuvered, and there's still the sense that they may not be the smarter side. It takes its theme of forced paternity to a different level by including Newt, played by Carrie Henn, in her only acting credit, who Ripley forms a bond with, and who she fights the alien queen to protect, essentially in an act of mom versus mom. Aliens feels like a natural continuation of the theme and the universe set out in Alien. It's not a retread, the pacing is very different, but it's very similar in the ideas it conveys. Alien 3 attempts to go back to the series' horror roots. There's one alien, a couple of dozen meat sacks, and no weapons. Again, oh dear. Alien 3's development was a protracted battle of committee think, rewrites, and clouded focus. William Gibson wrote a script that you can find online, which is considered by many to be better than the one that was actually made. It saw Michael Biehn's character from Aliens, Corporal Hicks, become the central protagonist. Alas, Bien doesn't appear in the film at all.
I didn't really even get paid very well for Alien, and I thought, okay, well, if there's anybody who's going to be... usually with any sequel like that, they keep the characters. It's just a done deal.
Reportedly, he was very angry about being written out, and demanded almost as much as he'd received for Aliens, just for the use of his likeness in Alien 3. Especially after Cameron had talked about Alien 3 featuring Hicks, Newt, and Ripley living on Earth as a family. David Toohey had a go at the script after Gibson, and he set it on a prison world. After that, Vincent Ward was brought in to write and direct. He wanted to set it on a Luddite world, something akin to a monastery. And Sigourney Weaver said that she'd only do another film if Ripley died at the end. Fox presented Ward with an ultimatum, however. Change the setting from a planet or satellite made out of wood to one of an ore refinery, and change the monks he wanted back to the prisoners that Toohey had written in. Ward refused, and he and the project parted. As the time of production for Alien 3 drew closer, script changes were still being made. David Fincher was finally brought on to direct, and he made his own changes too. And dare I say, I imagine a lot of what he did was also changed in the edit. I bring all this up because it doesn't really feel like a film that knows what it is. The script doesn't feel like it's had many writers, but rather that the film has used many different scripts that have been slammed together. The films establish interesting characters, not least the ones played by Charles Dance and Brian Glover, who are killed off within 3 minutes of each other before the halfway mark. The only other memorable character of note, other than Ripley of course, is Dylan, played by Charles S. Dutton. This might well add a momentary surprise for the audience, but quickly it feels as though these characters are wasted, particularly Dance's, which had been built up for the previous 30 minutes. For me, I think Charles Dance is an excellent actor, and his on-screen relationship with Weaver is what made Alien 3 momentarily interesting. Whereas Gibson's script returns to the action horror that made Alien successful, Fincher is firmly on the horror side of the divide. But still, it doesn't really feel like Alien at all. It lacks the claustrophobia of the Nostromo. Newt is killed before the film begins, and although it keeps the theme of forced pregnancy, it never expands on this subject. There's an alien queen growing in Ripley, but this seems more like a leftover theme rather than one that is explored with interest. It's lit very differently, and feels more candlelight than spaceship, which I wouldn't mind if the xenomorph kept its same mystical qualities. Instead, it almost feels like an arbitrary monster. It feels like it could be replaced by a masked psycho, or zombies, or something like that. Still, the film made $160 million, more than 3 times its budget. Of course, the production of Alien Resurrection was faced with a bit of a problem. Ripley had killed herself at the end of Alien 3, and Brandywine and Weaver herself weren't initially keen on another film. Joss Whedon wrote a script for Alien Resurrection where the final act is a battle on Earth. Only part of his script was used. Bryan Singer, Peter Jackson, and Danny Boyle were all approached to direct, and they all turned it down. In the end, it went to Jean-Pierre Jeunet. If Alien 3 was an attempt to return to the horror style of Alien, Resurrection returns to the action style of Aliens. It's about Ripley 8, a clone of the original Ripley who begins to remember what happened to, well, not her, and is imprisoned on a military research vessel where she only has time for basketball and I guess doing her nails. The evil scientists here are breeding and experimenting on aliens, and are supplied hosts for facehuggers by a lovable band of, well, slavers I guess. The aliens inevitably escape, and Ripley and the slavers have to stop the ship from reaching Earth by destroying it and escape themselves. The brand of action here is quite different. It's jokier and tongue-in-cheek. It kind of feels more like Hellboy than an Aliens film. I think it loses a lot of the sense of peril in Alien and Aliens, but it does have a similar pace. It starts off fairly slow and builds up to the inevitable point where the situation is totally out of control. Tom Woodruff Jr. and Alec Gillis, protégés of Stan Winston and founders of Studio ADI, or Amalgamated Dynamics, created and operated the puppets as they did with Alien 3. But Blue Sky Studios created a number of CGI aliens, and while I think they were very accomplished for the time, they're one element which makes Resurrection's universe look different to the rest. Of course, if you make one film in 1979 and the other in 1997, they're going to look different. The way they're captured is going to be different. Camera technology will have changed. In fairness to Resurrection, hundreds of years have passed since Resurrection and Alien. However, the tone of Resurrection seems inconsistent. One moment Ripley is appalled by experiments the scientists have done, and by finding her own not quite right clone. I guess they forgot to carry the remainder. This scene is played completely seriously, but not very long after we have Winona Ryder's character Call laughing with Ripley 8. There were kind of jokey bits with the Marines in Aliens, but when they started losing bodies, it still felt as though they were under stress, mourning for their comrades, and critically, scared. No one ever really feels scared in Resurrection. The previous films had all been serious, but this feels like a dark comedy, with only a few laughs.
Wayland, Utani.
They went under decades ago, get him in way before your time. Bought out by Walmart.
Resurrection does at least attempt to add something to the xenomorphs, although I'm not sure that the alien-human hybrid is very necessary. I thought the xenomorph was already a human hybrid. A lot of how people react to Resurrection might be down to how they approach the series. If they want a fun popcorn movie, perhaps Resurrection delivers. If they want a continuation of the theme of a group of doomed humans who are outclassed by the ultimate and most depraved predator, I'm not sure it does. People may not like Alien 3 because it delivers neither the horror of the first movie nor the action of the second, but Resurrection feels the most off-message. I'd also call it, not including the Alien vs Predator films, the most cynical. Then again, compared to other films that are off-message compared to their series, such as Terminator Genisys or Die Hard 5, Resurrection doesn't seem that different to previous films. There are prequel films, but no Alien 5, although there were plans for one. Neil Blomkamp reportedly, although he does deny this, wanted to continue the series after Aliens, essentially ignoring Alien 3 and Alien Resurrection. Those plans now have officially been cancelled. Now I am going to talk about Alien vs Predator, but not in as much detail. Not because I don't like those films, but more because those films don't belong to the same series. In my opinion, they're more like guest appearances. I'm not going to get into the swamp that is discussing what's canon and what's not, but these films are more of a what-if scenario. Undoing some of Alien vs Predator, Ridley Scott's prequel films have Peter Weyland as the founder of Weyland Corporation. The AVP films have Charles Bishop Weyland. The ideas of one or more xenomorphs fighting a predator have been around at least since the Predator in Predator 2 was shown to have a xenomorph skull as a trophy. The two films, Alien vs Predator and Alien vs Predator Requiem, are action-focused, and Dan O'Bannon contributed to the story of the first. Although he said he liked Alien vs Predator, Cameron ruled out any future involvement with the series after they came out. Really, they're modern-day B-movies, and that isn't a criticism. They're not aimed at an audience who are going to sit around afterwards eating cheese and talking about subtext. They may be fun, but they're not a continuation of the tone set in the first three Alien films. They're more akin to the not 100% serious feeling of Resurrection. Really, they're money spinners, and I think people's reaction to them depend on how they approach them. If you take them as another Alien film, well, they undoubtedly undermine the power and subtlety of the xenomorph design, and really make them into fodder. They may as well be zombies. But maybe if you approach these films as if they have no implications on the rest, if you kind of see the xenomorphs in the AVP movies as, well, different versions of what we know, they don't. Maybe in the way that World War Z represents zombies differently to Day of the Dead. I know it's not the same thing, but my point is that these films are different entities. Reportedly, one of the reasons why Sigourney Weaver wanted Ripley to be killed off at the end of Alien 3 was that because as far back as 1991, she'd heard that Fox wanted to do a crossover film. She hated the idea, and she wanted no part in it. Oh. Prometheus is a return to the Alien franchise by the first film's director, Ridley Scott. Scott came on board as director in 2009, after developing various ideas with Fox for another Alien film for much of that decade. The production was huge, with a budget of around $130 million, and principal photography lasting 82 days. Prometheus offers something new, but it's most similar in the series to Alien. It's comparable in that it's a horror where people get picked off one by very hostile alien lifeforms, and that it's not at all tongue-in-cheek. It's very serious in its delivery. It's also very different. It's about the hunt for man's origins. There are these big blue, almost plasticine aliens, and there's no xenomorph, or not as we know it. This is a prequel in the sense that the events that happen do so before the events of Alien. They don't necessarily lead into the events of that movie. The crashed spaceship may look similar to the one in Alien, but the film makes clear that these are different places. I think one difference is the way it looks. Again, it's inevitable, but Alien now has a retro feel. It's got CRT monitors and buttons and control panels. Prometheus offers us a very high-tech future which obviously doesn't fit into the technology of Alien. Again, this isn't criticism. If they'd recreated the look of Alien, the film would have likely been labelled a retro sci-fi. I still find the way that they represent technology very interesting. Ironically, it's way, way beyond what comes later in the series chronologically. Whether the film works or not, it actively tries to move the series along rather than rehash the same old ideas. An interesting point that I've often heard made is that an important aspect of Alien is that it has a strong female lead. Well, I have quite mixed feelings about that. Ripley was written as a man, and although the film is about space rape, I don't really see it as a gender thing. In the first film, it's Kane who becomes impregnated. Prometheus 2, when it came out, had a lot said about its strong female lead, but I'm not entirely sure who that is. Is it Noomi Rapace's character, Elizabeth Shaw, or is it Charlize Theron?
My company paid $1 trillion to find this place and to bring you here. Had you raised the monies yourself, Mr. Holloway, we'd happily be pursuing your agenda.
Elizabeth Shaw survives until the end, but Charlize Theron's character, Vickers, is perhaps more memorable. She doesn't put up with any bullshit. She's strong. I think Prometheus, like Alien, splits its time between characters, and it does this so you don't know who's going to survive. But by the end of Alien, and really for the last 30 minutes, I knew that Ripley was the main character. I'm not so sure that's true about Elizabeth Shaw. David, played by Michael Fassbender, is really the critical component in the story. He's what makes things go wrong. I'm tempted to say, especially in light of Alien Covenant, that he's the main character. This is a critical difference, if true, because he's a robot, but more importantly because he's an antagonist. The film actively raises a lot of questions, and it's different to Alien in that it feels more about exploring than surviving. On the Nostromo, the crew were trapped, they had to fight the alien, but here it feels as if the crew could abort their mission at any time. They're pushed on by their own motivations. Nowhere near as actiony as Aliens, I feel that Prometheus asks more sci-fi what-if questions than any other film in the series, and maybe not as subtly. It feels as though it really did set off to be a high-concept science fiction poster child, and is very overt in that. One thing I have to mention are the monsters themselves in both Prometheus and Alien Covenant. Really, they're proto-xenomorphs, and the effects in both movies rely on a mix of practical and digital effects. Both films present us with a black substance that can be used to mutate and incept invasive cells into unsuspecting organisms, namely the characters we're following. There's a great deal more variety of monsters and mutations, especially in Prometheus, than there were in the previous films, but I'm not sure this adds anything to the mythos. The two prequel films hint at where the xenomorphs as we knew them before might have come from, but if anything I'd argue a lot of what made them so intriguing is that we didn't know. This is one of the critical differences between the Ripley-era films and the new prequels. Before, this wasn't an issue. Now this reveal of where the aliens came from seems to be one of the main attractions. Alien Covenant is easily the film in the series most like its immediate predecessor. It's not exactly the same, the story arc is very different, but it is tonally very congruent and is a very clear continuation of Prometheus' story, if not at first. The story is about the crew of Covenant, a colonization ship, including Michael Fassbender as another android. The where does he get those hats Walter, exploring a world seemingly ideal for colonization. Here's the spoiler, it's not. The crew meet David, also played by Fassbender, in a city of the civilization alluded to in Prometheus. The city is in ruins, and it's in ruins because of David. The key difference in Covenant is that it makes David into the antagonist. Before his actions were quite ambiguous, but in this film they're made clear. Beforehand it was the xenomorph or xenomorphs and maybe somebody like Burke in Aliens. Here it's a non-xenomorph and a very strong antagonist who I would consider the main character. David has been made into a very strong character that we can get behind the attempted destruction of, and I wonder if that's how this prequel series will end, no matter how many films it takes. To kill off David but carry on with the series would feel very wasteful and almost like starting a new series. I wonder too if Walter, the good Fassbender, will return.
Must feel like your God abandoned you.
What?
To lose Dr. Holloway after your father died under such similar circumstances.
Once we realise that the film rejoins David, I think it's pretty obvious what's going to happen. Anyone who's at all familiar with film motifs knows that if there's clones or there's twins or characters who look alike, at some point they're going to switch. And that's exactly what happens. And that's not a problem, but the film's very ambiguous about it, and I feel it's way more obvious than the film realises. The reason I bring this up isn't to say, oh, I can see a narrative construct. It's because Covenant feels like it's an attempt to make the loftiest Alien film yet. It philosophises and broods, but there are many things you can nitpick about it. Why didn't they wear hazardous suits when they went down to the planet? Why didn't they check to see if Walter, who has an evil twin who by the way is unaccounted for, is actually Walter before going into cryosleep? I'm pointing this out because as much as Covenant quotes Byron and Shelley, and it certainly isn't dumb, maybe it isn't the smartest in the series. It certainly wants to be, but I think that accolade belongs to Alien. Covenant, like Alien, presents avenues of thought, it presents interesting ideas, but Alien never really needed to tell us all about it. Those are my thoughts on how the Alien films have changed over time. There will be 2 more films after Covenant, and Ridley Scott has expressed interest in doing more, so we'll see what happens. I think the key difference is that the Alien films, when they had Ripley in them, were pretty self-contained. The situation was resolved, and then, at the beginning of a new film, there was another situation to contend with. Now, with the prequels, they seem to lead into each other a lot more. What do you guys think about the series? I'd be especially interested to know what you think about Prometheus and Covenant, and what you expect from the future. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so, it helps me out a lot, and join me next time where I'll be discussing Roger Moore. See you then.